Good evening, everyone. Welcome tonight to our Designing Your Sheep and Goat Grazing System webinar. Before we get started with our guest presentators, I am going to walk you through how to use Zoom in case you're not familiar with that and need a little assistance. As you will see, this is a screenshot of what your screen will look like, and you have some controls on the bottom. I would like to direct your attention to the lower left-hand corner where the unmute icon is. And if you will keep that on the unmute, which means your microphone will have a red slash through it, that will keep any background noise from interfering with our presentation tonight and our recording. Next to that icon is a start video or take off your video. So if you would go ahead and keep your video off tonight, that will also help with our presentation. We will be using our chat feature here in the middle of your screen for you to communicate with us tonight and ask questions. So feel free to ask questions in the chat box. If you would like to make sure that everybody is in on the conversation, please select everyone when you do create a chat. For our contact information tonight, you can reach out to our Livestock Outreach Program Manager, Megan Nelson, myself, Carolyn Edie, Jean Schrieffer, and Adam Abel. So like I said, thank you for joining us tonight. We have a great presentation tonight, and I am so excited. I think a lot of you may be also, as we're seeing our green grass grow and getting ready to turn our sheep and goats and maybe some other animals out on pasture. Tonight we have two speakers, Jean Schrieffer, who is the ag educator for UW-Madison Division of Extension in Iowa County. He works with the Southwest Wisconsin Grazing Network and helps producers and landowners with conservation, soil health, farm profitability, and beef and small ruminant production. His interest in grazing began as a teenager, trying to avoid working, feeding his family's livestock. He and his wife have sheep and a beef grazing operation that was established in 1985. Joining us later in tonight's program will be Adam Abel, the NRCS soil conservationist in Northeast Wisconsin and Appleton, Wisconsin. Adam has been working with grazing on his family farm since he was 8 years old, and he has for the past 17 years focused on helping people produce livestock with grazing. So without any further ado, because I know that you all did not come here to listen to me speak, I'm going to turn it over to Jean.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Carolyn. Let me see if I can't do my screen share correctly this evening and see where we go. And let's see. Okay, are you getting the presentation screen? Can you?
Yes, we are.
Okay, let me get myself out of the way here. So, yeah, good evening, folks. Glad to be here. Usually I get to sit in the background and kind of manage things and help out in the chat box, answering questions. This evening, I get to be out front and chat with you all tonight about grazing. We're lambing still. We've got 4 ewes left. We had another set of twins this evening, and our pastures are getting awfully close. And I know I'm looking forward to grazing, and I know that our sheep and I think our cattle also are really they're smelling the grass. They know, and we're running a pretty hot fence now because everybody wants to work it pretty hard and get going. You know, as an extension person, and before while I was working as a grazing specialist, we always think about why would we want to graze sheep or goats. And there's lots of multiple reasons. I don't know if there's a single right reason. It's more what's important to you or what's important in general. When we've got a good managed grassland, it's really creates a very healthy soil. When we've got active growing plants, it increases soil diversity in not only numbers, but in soil species. And we know that when we have that diversity, it improves soil. It makes the soil more porous, more able to absorb water. And if we can infiltrate that water from these intense rainfalls more quickly, that's a good thing. We have less erosion, so we can conserve and build soil, but that soil also holds on to and stores the water, which enables us to grow more grass and feed more livestock. So those are good things. It also, when we can have those good grasslands and we've got that diversity in the soil, we see an explosion of insects, not just insects competing with our sheep or goats for grass, but insects that are eating some of the soil life, insects that are eating other insects. And there's this, if you go out into a good pasture, there's a hum, and it's a hum of life, and it's all those living organisms out there. We have a large insect population, and suddenly, before you know it, we have a host of grassland birds. All of these things are all interconnected, and it relates to how well we steward our pastures and how well we manage our grass. So it's really a key foundation, or I guess I'd say a foundation of this whole biological system when we manage grasslands correctly. Now, I didn't start out like this raving conservationist. What attracted me to grazing many years ago was simply economics. And this started back when I was in college. We were starting to do some modeling with computers and doing some forecasts. And every time I shifted from cropping to grazing, the profit that we were forecasting over a 5-year period for the farm improved. And then as I started looking at more and more grazing attributes on the farm, I started to compare beef with sheep. And by golly, sheep seemed like a really good alternative. And that's how this thing started. And as I started grazing, I didn't have a lot of equity, so it was an easy way for me to get into farming. And over time, I saw all these other things start to come. We saw the water infiltration improve. We saw just the health in the soil improve. We saw the birds coming back. I didn't know we had all these endangered species, and yet suddenly here they are on the farm. So there's lots of good reasons why grazing is good and why sheep and goat grazing is also a good thing to have. But, as I sit at the office or online, people will email a question and they'll say, well, we'd like to graze sheep or goats, and how many should I have? And, I'm an extension agent. I work for the university, and the answer is it depends, right? That's the university answer. And it's really an unsatisfying answer to hear, because I've asked the question on some other topics and I've gotten the it depends answer. It's also unsatisfying to give. And but it's just a longer drawn out question. It's a simple question that has a more complex answer. So designing your system it's a planning process. We have to think about a series of variables, measure them as best we can, and then kind of forecast what we think is going to occur under normal or average circumstances. So it's really our best guess of what we think is going to happen. So when we think about that question of it depends, well, it depends on what type of sheep or goats are you planning to raise, or do you already raise? Where is this farm located, and what are the soils that are present on your farm? So down here in southwestern Wisconsin, our growing season is longer than if you were up in Rusk or Sawyer County in the far northern parts of Wisconsin. We probably have about a month to a month and a half longer growing season. We can grow different types of different length of a growing season. We also have different soils as you go around the state. And actually, if you're in the driftless region, and I see some people that I know from the driftless region, we have a lot of variability in our soils on our farms. So, and people own farms for different reasons. And I'm not going to say one reason is better than another, but I want to know what your goals are. How much time do you have to put into this? Are you interested in land stewardship? Are you just trying to keep the grass and the brush down and keeping invasive species out? Are you only raising goats and sheep? Or do you have cattle or chickens or pigs? Are there any future long-term goals? Is your goal profit? Is it just reducing your property taxes? Are you interested in meat, milk, or fiber, or are you thinking about organic production? So there's lots of things that we take into consideration when we're trying to plan or lay out the best system or a good system for what it is that's important to you, and that's really what a good grazing planner should do for you. So they have this influence. We can't ignore those other things. I can design a perfect system that I would use, but if you won't, it really wasn't a perfect system. So what do we need to know? We need to know what the soils are present on the farm. We need to know the type of sheep or goats that you're raising. Are you raising Wiscent sheep? And Gene says, well, you can have 3 sheep per acre, and I don't know you're raising Wiscent. Why am I picking Wiscent sheep? They're the smallest sheep in the world. They're 17 inches tall. They weigh 25 pounds. 3 sheep would be totally wrong, right? If I tell you 3 sheep and you're raising Suffolks, not just any Suffolk, you're raising the Shetland pony size Suffolks that weigh 300 pounds, 3 sheep is totally wrong. And when we think about our sheep over their production stages or our does over their production stages, a dry doe or a dry ewe eats different amounts of forage or needs a different amount of forage than a lactating ewe or a lactating ewe doe. So we can look some of this information up. The National Research Council publishes a lot of nutrition data on about every 8 or 10 years. They update this. We've got it for goat production. We also have it for sheep production. As I went through that book, I looked up the feed requirements for a 154-pound ewe. And let me see if I can turn my pointer on here and maybe do some little highlighting. So as we look at the maintenance for a 154-pound ewe, she needs about 1.66% of her body weight each day in feed. And if we jump down and look at what that same ewe needs during lactation, after she's lambed, her intake jumps up to 2.8% of her body weight, not quite doubling, but that's a huge increase. So we need to take into consideration what's the average intake that our animals are going to require on our pasture. And it does vary a little bit based on the size of the sheep or the size of the goats. So the first thing we work on is we want to calculate a forage budget. And the best way that I've found to do this is working with something called the Web Soil Survey. This is a tool developed by NRCS, which is part of the USDA. NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and Adam will give us a lot of good information on them a little bit later. But they have this tool. It's an online tool. It's cloud-based that anybody can use. They've made it freely available to the entire world to capitalize on it. And we can learn what soils are present on our farm. In some cases, we can also learn the productivity of different forages that might grow on those soils. We don't have it for everything, but we have it for quite a few. We also want to think about, at least in our pastures, what are those dominant forage species that are present or that we'd like to try to establish if we're establishing new pastures. There's a management function of, are we highly managing or moderate management or low management? The other factor that comes into productivity of our pastures is soil fertility. That is something we have to learn over time. We're not going to talk about soil fertility tonight, but it can have an impact on how much forage we can expect or reasonably expect to grow off our grazing acres. After we've looked at how much forage we can grow, we looked at the other side of that coin, and that is, how do we spend that forage? What can we invest that forage in our livestock? So here we need to know what's the average weight of that animal. In that example I used in the previous slide, we had a 154-pound ewe. Now, if you've got a 110-pound ewe, she's going to consume a different amount of forage. So we need the size, we need to estimate the intake per head per day, and then about how many grazing days a year do you think you're going to be able to do? We also need to know what's the size of the herd or what's the size of the flock. We want to take into consideration, are you supplementing on pasture for whatever reason? And another factor to consider in the planning process is your goal to be self-sufficient for hay or forage? Are you trying to make hay off of these acres so we're feeding our flock or our herd year round? Or are we going to purchase hay elsewhere? All of these things come into play in calculating what's the carrying capacity for any given acres and helps us with that planning process. So we're going to show you, I just took some snips from the web soil survey. I'm not trying to make you an expert tonight on how to use the web soil survey. I just want to show you that this information is available to you. You can go, can't hurt it. I don't think you can break it. Don't worry about it. But it's available there. It's a great resource to find a lot of information about your farm and your soils. So it's point and shoot. You're going to click and zoom into an area. In this photo here, or this snip here, I've highlighted our target farm. This actually happens to be our farm here in Dodgeville. So we're going to trace that out. And then we at the top of you'll see a series of tabs that we can use. So right now we're identifying what's called an area of interest. Then we can get to the soil map, and then the soil data explorer gives us a lot of more in-depth layers of information about our farm and our soils. So here's our project area, our farm area. This is what the soil map of this highlighted area is. And of course, it's my farm. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this out is because of the variability that we can see on some soils in some parts of the state. And most farms have, several soil types on them, and they're not all equally productive. In this left column here, you can see these two soil types, a Gale silt loam. I like to pick this one out because it's my worst soil. The map also shows us how many acres of this really bad soil I've got on my farm. So this Gale soil is really steep, it's really shallow, and in a good year, I might get about 2,000 pounds of dry matter off of that. Why do I want to show that to you? Because the next soil in this list is called a Chaseberg soil. You don't need to know all these names. There's not going to be a test. But this Chaseberg is a low soil. It's a floodplain soil. It's deep, it's wet, it's fertile. This is my best soil. This type of soil will grow 8,000 pounds of dry matter in a year, right next to an area that'll only grow about 2,000 pounds of dry matter. So these are some of the challenges that we have to deal with, and some of the variability that we need to take into consideration as we're working through this process. The good news is, if you're in Wisconsin and a lot of other states, if you're from outside Wisconsin, there are grazing professionals that can help you with this. Certainly you can do this yourself. A lot of people are self-taught, but there's people out there that can help us with this. So we've identified our soils, and we've looked up through the web soil survey. We can find some of the productivity values for some of these soils and certain crops. We may not find them all. Then we've got to do a little bit more homework. We need to talk to the neighbors, see what type of forage yields they're getting, if they've got a similar soil on their farm. You talk to NRCS, you talk to Extension. You just kind of gather that data and get a good estimate of what we should expect from that. So then we're going to look at how much forage can my grazing acres actually produce. So, we could go through every single soil type, and we try to be a little bit more efficient than that and group them together. And I just put them into higher quality soils or higher productivity soils, medium productivity soils, and of course, those low productivity soils. Then, at least in this example, I'm looking at orchard grass and red clover on our high and medium quality soils, and our low production soils, I'm guessing, is going to be mostly bluegrass white clover. It just doesn't have the soil depth or fertility to support a lot of growth. We've highlighted that we've got 10 acres of these, 15 acres of the mediums, and 5 of that. Estimated yield 8,500 on the high qualities, 3 tons or 6,000 pounds on the medium, and that low quality soil about 2,000 pounds. So we have a total yield for each of those areas, a total yield for those 30 acres, 185,000 pounds, or about 92.5 tons. That's about a little over 3.1 tons or so on average. Of course, the good soils produce more, the poor soils produce a little bit less. So that's what we've got to spend, right? That's our budget in an average year under average management. We do the same thing or a similar thing for our livestock. We want to identify what groups of animals do we have on the farm and how many of those heads and how many days grazing are we planning to do. In this example, I've made this a sheep farm. We've got our mature ewes, an average weight of 130 pounds. We really, I understand that ewes will fluctuate in weight across the year, but we're not trying to put on pounds of weight. Estimated daily dry matter consumption of 3.46 pounds. I use 3.5% of the body weight just to give me a little bit of fudge factor. I don't want to put this on a razor thin margin and then run out of grass. So I'm going to be a little bit conservative and try and overestimate some of my dry matter consumption for these ewes. It also leaves us a little fudge factor for some trampling waste. We're saying we've got 60 head already, and we plan to graze 240 days. So that's about 8 months. That's very possible, certainly down here in the southern part of the state. This gives us a total amount of feed needed, and that would take about 10.6 acres to run those sheep or those ewes. We do the same exercise for our replacement ewes. These are smaller. They're not full grown yet. We do want these to gain weight. We want them to try and gain a half a pound a day, or maybe we want them to gain a third of a pound a day. So we take that beginning and an average weight, and we base our consumption based on that. We've got 15 head, or we've got about a 25% replacement rate. Again, we're grazing those 240 days. I've got rams, 220 pounds, 2 rams to breed 60 sheep. And really, we keep these locked up in the barn. You might have them on pasture, and that's fine. I'm just saying in this example, we're going to keep them locked up in the barn, except for maybe a 45-day breeding season. That's a little long, but we're just going to say 45 days. And we're estimating that total forage needs. And then finally, we got a guard donkey, right? Something's got to be out there protecting the flock from those darn coyotes. So our coyote is, or excuse me, our coyote's not 600 pounds, our donkey's 600 pounds. And we're going to budget some hay for that or forage for that. So we add all those up and we see we need about 45 tons of hay or forage to feed this group of livestock. That would take about half of those acres. We have 30 available. We could supply all that feed, we think, with about 15 acres. So this means that we could do 2 things. We could take a little hay off of that other 15 acres and have some feed for winter, or we could have more sheep, or maybe we could add goats or cattle or something else to the mix if we'd like to do so. So we know that we have plenty of feed to supply this size of a flock that we've already planned. Now, if we were going to say that I want all of my hay to come from the farm, so hay plus grazing, we would change our forage days to 365 and get a total demand on that forage for the entire year. So sizing the paddock is where we start to really dive down into this planning process. So we know how big the flock is. We know our forage demand per day. So then we need to think about how many days per paddock would we like to keep this group of grazing animals there on average. Now, this could be a half a day, which means we'd be moving twice a day, or we might be out to 7 days. And there's some people that go to 14 days or 3 weeks or longer periods. But we know from research here in the Midwest that when something takes that first bite, that the plant wants to regrow by the 3rd day. And if we get into that 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th day, our livestock are trying to graze that fresh, lush regrowth. They take that first bite or second bite, which then weakens the plant. So our harvest efficiency actually decreases the longer that we leave livestock in a particular paddock. We have more trampling losses. The grazing regrowth is slowed down. Our recovery periods also get longer, and our total seasonal yield goes down. So our rest period is that time when we're not grazing. So here we need to allow grass to recover before we graze it again. And the extension answer is, how long is that? It depends. It depends on, different forage species require a different recovery time. Some recover faster, some recover slower. They need more rest, some need less rest. It also is impacted by soil moisture. If we got good soil moisture, plants recover quickly. If it's dry, it takes a longer period of time. Temperature comes into play. We have mostly cool season grasses here in Wisconsin, and when we get into July and August, we're out of that optimum zone for these cool season grasses. As we get into the 80s and 90s, cool seasons do okay, but they slow way down. So that impacts our recovery time. Grazing residual is what we leave behind in the pasture. That's the forage not grazed. And the more residual we leave, the faster that plant recovers. Think about that residual as the solar panel. If we leave that solar panel intact, the grass comes back faster. So grass really isn't considered recovered until it's grown its third leaf. So we see 1, 2, 3 leaves here. Now this plant will start to grow another new leaf. We could call that leaf 4, but what happens is that first leaf will start to senesce. It'll start to die back. It'll start to turn brown. It'll start to lose some forage value. So grass only ever has 3 leaves. Now the difference between 3-leaf grass this tall and 3-leaf grass this tall is fertility and species. So we wait for that 3-leaf stage to occur, and then that's the best time to start coming back and regrazing that paddock for the second, third, or fourth time. So let's just look at how we pull all this together, and some of the assumptions that I've made earlier. I had a 240-day grazing period in there. I wanted to have a 40-day rest period, just thinking about summer. And we planned for a 3-day occupancy. So when we go through and do some math, we find out we need about 14 separate paddocks. Each paddock is going to be grazed about 6 times each year. And in this case, I'm going to say we can run our replacements and our ewes in the same flock. Maybe during the breeding season, we might like to separate those out, but most of the year, we're going to keep those 2 groups of sheep together. That makes our average paddock size about 1.1 acres. So that's an average. That's not what every single paddock is going to be, because we've got this variability. Remember, we talked about that with soils. Some soils produce more forage and some produce less. We can have some slide here. Some will be a little bit bigger. Some might be a little bit smaller. But on average, we're looking at something about 1.1 acres in size. So when we're laying out our paddocks, it helps to have a good aerial map. Now we can do this online. We can use the Web Soil Survey. I like to use Google Earth. I think they've got great photos. That initial photo on the opening slide was Google Earth from last year. And the first thing we're going to do is identify our property lines. Then we want to do an overlay, if we can, of our soil map. This is the map that we showed earlier. And then we want to identify where our current pastures are. I like to identify my neighbor's pastures, and I also want to kind of highlight where the streams or the water resources are on the farm. So we go back to that first photo we've drawn in. You can see this is the crop ground up here on our ridge. We've got some pastures down here. This thin blue line represents some perennial streams. And then we've got a couple other orphan crop fields around the farm. So we've got those things identified, and then we're trying to lay out those 1.1 acres or whatever size paddock it is that's right for your farm. So what does this look like? In the end, we wind up with something that may not look this complex. This is our farm, or my farm here in Dodgeville. And on this, my goal was to have a 3-day rotation and for 300 sheep. So we wound up with about a 5-acre paddock on average. The yellow lines represent our permanent fences. And as I went and grazed longer and longer and kind of gained more experience, I was seeing the benefits of making some of these paddocks smaller. Well, I've already put up all these permanent fences. I didn't really want to build more. So I started using temporary fences. The red lines represent those temporary subdivisions that we can take a large paddock and make it into a smaller paddock to get some increased production off of these areas. The blue lines represent my piped water system. The light blue is, of course, the stream. And our green line, this is just future development, fences yet to be built that haven't yet occurred. So this is what it looks like on a map. The value of doing it virtually is if we can always erase it or do undo and change these things around and see what it looks like. So we can make changes really easily before we build a fence. And it's always good to change your mind before you actually build something. What's it look like in practice? This is a photo from a few years ago.
Wow.
This is you can see our crop ground here on some of our contours. This is a permanent fence here. And then around that, we've got some temporary fencing containing the flock. This was about 400 ewes for one day, and then they'd have to move on to the next area. This was actually probably about 10 years ago as I'm looking at this, because I see I've got water tanks here at the top of the hill, which means I was hauling water. I've now put in a water line down here, so we've got a pipe system all the way out here now. So we've laid out our paddocks. We've got our paddock sizes, what we think is about right. What are our fencing choices? We've got lots of fencing choices. Oops, hang on. We can build a board fence. We can build a woven wire fence, barbed wire, smooth wire, or smooth electric. I have these in decreasing cost. So a board fence is very attractive. It's very durable, but it's very expensive to build. Nothing wrong with it. It's just more costly. Woven wire, very effective. Again, more costly. It takes more posts. Barbed wire can work for sheep and goats. We need a few extra strands out there, but it does work. Smooth wire without electric. We need a few more strands of wire to contain our animals. And then smooth electric. And this is usually my fence of choice because it's fast and it's cheap and it's effective. I really use electric very heavily on our farm. Nothing wrong with those other ones. They all can work. But for me, I do prefer that smooth electric. When we think about cost, a temporary fence, which is it's plastic with some metal filaments running through it. That can actually be fairly cheap to use, but it only lasts 3 to 5 years. It can last a little longer than that if we take good care of it. If we don't leave it out all winter, that seems to be pretty tough on it. So up front, that's not a bad expense because we can move that around as we move our goats or move our sheep around. Permanent fence is going to last you 20 years. So with permanent fence, we have a large upfront cost, but when we amortize it over a 20-year life expectancy, the cost per year is actually pretty reasonable. And at some point you say, you know, I don't want to be moving fence every day, right? So some permanent fences I think are a good thing, but maybe not everywhere. We want to think about the location of some of these fences, especially in regards to stream corridors. If you've got water coming through the farm, and water on the farm is a good thing, but it comes with a flood risk. When we get these big rains and you've got a 4-foot cottonwood stump flowing down, your fence won't stand up. It's just going to get taken out. And so really the challenge is, how much fence do you want to fix after the flood? I'd prefer to fix that small gap where that water course is rather than an entire quarter mile or half-mile fence, because we built the whole thing in one piece. So that's why we want to identify those streams and where the flood risks are. I like to think about, I don't know if we can have too many gates when it comes to property. Each property owner should have at least one gate, in my opinion, because no matter how good we build a fence, livestock get out. Your livestock will get out, the neighbor's livestock will get out, and if they're in your pasture or yours in their pasture, we need to get them home. And I don't want to cut a hole in the fence. If we just install a gate, it's a really simple thing, and it helps both parties out. The last bullet point I have in there is predators, and fencing can be part of the discussion on predator control. We won't get into predators too much tonight, but fencing can help deter some predation in some particular cases. So when we think about fencing, larger is always going to be more efficient than smaller. So for example, if we had 1 acre square, that's going to take 834 feet to go around that 1 acre. If we had 40 acres, maybe a nice farmette, that's going to take a mile of fence. It's 1,320 feet on the side, so 1 mile fences all the way around it. If we look at that relationship, we've got 40 times more area, but it's only costing us 6 times more fence. So when we start building fences, we don't want to fence too small. We'd like to fence a larger area if at all possible. The other thing I'd like to think about is if we're going to be making any hay off of any of these grazing acres, or maybe we've got separate acres, we don't want to make a bunch of small paddocks that's going to interfere with the haymaking process, especially if you're hiring somebody to do this for you, if you're not doing it yourself. So not having fences in the way, it facilitates haymaking. That's a great place to be utilizing some temporary or portable fencing. Ideally, I like to see larger permanent paddocks, and then we utilize technology, small temporary paddocks to create these 1 day, 3 day, however many day breaks that we'd like to keep these things, to keep our critters contained for that period of time. Now, this graph is just looking at the relationship to the cost of building 10 paddocks relative to the size of the pasture. And it really pulls all of this together where we a larger parcel is cheaper to fence on a per acre basis. So if we're dealing with anything less than about 40 to 50 acres, I think we want to fence the perimeter with permanent fencing. And then I really recommend people think about temporary fencing options for all of those in interior subdivisions. Maybe one major subdivision, but the rest is going to be with temporary wire. As we get larger, those costs really get to be pretty minimal to subdivide, an 80 or 100 acre or larger pasture. The fence cost is really not a significant expense for us. So watering options, I'm going to just briefly touch on this because I think I'm probably running out of time. We've got streams, we've got ponds, we've got groundwater. Now, sheep and goats are desert creatures. Historically, that's where they evolved. They're not really fond of water, or they're not fond of wet areas and mud. They'll certainly use a stream for water. But when we've got wet areas or ponds or streams, we also have to be aware of a parasite called meningeal worm, which naturally infects white-tailed deer. And we all know how many white-tailed deer we have in Wisconsin. So if we've got livestock grazing in there, or at least our sheep and goats and alpacas are all terribly susceptible to this meningeal worm. The other parasite that lives in these wet areas are liver flukes. So we can use these. I use these for water, but we also use a lot of groundwater and a pipe system. Tanks can be small and portable. When we've got a small tank, it recharges more often, the water stays cooler, and our sheep and goats drink more, which is good for them. Black plastic pipe, or HDPE, it's very durable, it's pretty inexpensive. I like to run it along the fences to avoid mower blight. And anywhere there's a traffic lane where I drive a tractor or truck or your ATV over, that's an area to bury it or protect it more from vehicle traffic. Above ground lines work perfectly well for the growing season, but as soon as it starts to freeze in the fall or maybe a late spring frost, those pipes can freeze and it bust fittings. Sometimes we might need to bury a shallow line that'll give us about an extra month of water system if we've got a pipe system. We really only want to bury those lines below frost if there's an area that it's really necessary to have year-round water. I don't know that it's necessary to plumb the whole farm with year-round water, but most of more or less where we'd like to keep those grazing critters in the fall of the year. So planning your system, it's something you can learn. I'm always impressed with producers that develop their plan all with no help at all. And it makes me feel, not useful anymore, that they figure, and they do great. They do, maybe I do things a little bit differently, but that's just my bias. Something you can learn. There's help that's available if you're unfamiliar or uncertain. And in some cases, there's help with the planning, and there may be even help with establishing your system. And this really leads us directly into the next section, and that's working with your Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of USDA. And that'll be my end for this evening, but we will hopefully have a little time to take some questions a little bit later.
Jean, as we transfer to Adam's presentation, I just have a question. Adam's been doing a great job answering those questions in the chat, but one is probably a little more personal than he can answer. But people would like to know what size your farm is. And I think importantly, maybe the size of that paddock where you had all of those ewes in that image that you showed us.
Sure. Let's see. The entire farm is about 256 acres. I still rent about 50 acres to the neighbors because I don't really need all of it yet. That photo, we were running about 420 ewes. That would have been slightly less than an acre in size. And my goal at that time was to get up around 50 to 60,000 pounds of live weight per acre, or a little bit over a pound per square foot. We're now pushing that up to about 100,000 pounds of live weight per acre. There's some grazers, and I'm not saying you have to do this at all. I'm just saying this is just how different grazers are approaching it. We've got, some stocker fellas that are moving 3, 4, 5 times a day. They're at 200, 250. And I'm not saying you have to do that at all. It fits some situations, certain circumstances where maybe or maybe not that's an appropriate thing for you to do. And we also have cattle. So I'm just showing you the sheep photos tonight. We have actually raised a few goats. I was thinking about diversifying into goats, but we're sticking with sheep and cattle for now. And we raise about half of our hay, and the other half of the hay we are purchasing, because I don't control the weather. Some years we make good hay, other years we don't, so I can buy what I don't make.
Very good. There are a few questions coming in on the chat. Maybe you can field those while Adam does his presentation, or we can chat about them afterwards as a group in the whole. So very good. Thank you, Jean. You're getting me really excited about dividing up my smaller pastures into more manageable paddocks. So very good. Adam, if you would like to take the floor, I'll turn it over to you.
We just had a really good conversation there, and I was hoping that while I'm getting my presentation up, the one part that I thought Jean could maybe expound upon would be the difference between the ewes' needs over the different course of the season versus the planning percentage that we use to address the different grass growth throughout the season, the higher percentages in May versus the summer slump, and why you were using 3.5% versus the lower percentage that were shown to be required on that, just for buffer's sake.
Yeah, we could go through and say 60 days at 1.6, and I mean, we could certainly do that and really tweak that pretty intently. And in the spring of the year, we're trying, at least for our farm, my goal is to have that lactating ewe on my cheapest, best feed, which for us is always pasture. The quality, I can't buy that type of quality, or excuse me, I can't afford to buy that type of quality, what we can grow on the farm. And so we're feeding the ewe the cheapest, best feed at a period of greatest demand. And that's why we lamb at the time of year that we do. We could lamb a little bit later on pasture. A lot of folks are doing that, but you're trying to time those things at those two different points in time. Now remember that, grazers, we've got a certain grazing area, but we also have time. that we can use as a lever or a dial in tweaking our system. So we control space and time. The spring of the year, I might not leave something on for 3 days. I'm doing more of a flash graze. I'm going through the paddocks a little bit faster. And now we're starting to get into a 200 level grazing rather than kind of getting you guys all fired up about grazing. So we can control that intake and the quality of that intake by how quickly that we move them. On that first day, any sheep or any doe is going to graze the very best feed that's available out there. So on the second day, it's a little bit lower quality. On the third day, it's a little bit lower quality. So they're always picking the best stuff first. And so we've got a few different things that we can do to control, but I'm going to talk all night if we start getting into this, but I'll hang around and I'll answer questions in the chat box.
Hey. So I'll jump right into this then. Can someone just confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see it, Adam.
Perfect. So I'm Adam Abel. I work with the NRCS. I currently live in Appleton, Wisconsin. I've had the opportunity to work all over the state. Gene and I have known each other for years, and this has been a ton of fun, and I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation. Sheep and goats are something that are very interesting. I think that when you start looking at the numbers at that, it's really something to look at closely. And they really do pencil out nicely when you look at the different economics. And we've talked with different lending companies with this. We've worked with the different tech colleges, and done right, it's a great way to make some money on your farm and also to hit some other benefits from that. So Gene asked me to talk a little bit about who I work for. I work for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. And we're going to get into a little bit about how we can assist grazers with setting up grazing. So my computer's going a little slow here. So hopefully it works. There. All right. Sorry. There we go. So why is the NRCS interested in prescribed grazing? So here's the big deal. The NRCS is not necessarily interested in prescribed grazing. All right. When you look at what we started out as, we're started out in Gene's country, down in the Coulee region. We started out as a soil conservation service, which then grew into the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And our agency's goal and mission is to prevent soil erosion, to improve water quality, to improve soil health, and just really have a positive impact on the environment. So when you start looking at what you can do with rotational grazing and you start implementing grass across 5 acres, 10 acres, 100 acres, 2,000 acres, that gets really powerful. There is not any type of engineering that we can do that competes as far as an economic or cost return over just implementing and putting down an acre of grass. When we have grass, we get infiltration, we get buffer, we get water quality, we get soil stabilization, we get into the soil health aspects, and then things just start really rolling. And then if you start tying that back to just production agriculture, which is really what this is, it can really work well for everybody. We can win with the environment, we can win with the livestock, and we can win with the producer. There are multiple studies out there. This one was done, I believe it's, I forget where it's ROTS in 2009. So you can look it up. I've got it noted on the bottom where the study was. I believe this one was out of Pennsylvania, but there were studies in Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa. They all show roughly the same numbers. We put land, take it out of row crops, when we put it back into permanent pastures, we have 24% less sediment loss. So the erosion washing off the field, we're able to maintain our topsoil. We're able to maintain that valuable soil that's actually going to produce and grow and keep the organic matter there. We have less P runoff. So when I say P, it's phosphorus. And that's a really important thing to consider, especially in Wisconsin. Phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in most of our state's waters. And I had a really strong statement that was given to me in college that really sticks to me today. So if you take 1 pound of phosphorus and pour it into waterways in the state of Wisconsin, depending on which river system or lake system you're in, that is enough phosphorus to create 500 to 1,000 pounds of algae on a dry weight basis. So because phosphorus is the limiting nutrient, we've got enough nitrogen, we've got enough potassium, we've got enough magnesium. If we take some phosphorus, we add that to our waterways, we get algae. So living in Wisconsin, we all appreciate water quality. So if we can keep that phosphorus on these soils, we really reduce the surface water quality, and we have a much better quality of life because of that. We've got cleaner waters. Everybody wins with that. And the reason this becomes important is because in general, until phosphorus is saturated, the only way for it to really get off your place is through soil erosion. It's like a magnet attached to a soil particle, and it's got to wash down into that waterway. So when we start talking about soil erosion and washing that into the rivers, that's how our phosphorus is getting in there, or at least that's the first avenue that phosphorus is getting into our waterways. Then there is the soluble that runs off, but realistically, that first big hit is what we're looking at in general for a lot of these grazing systems. Then there's a lower volatilization of ammonia, so we're losing less nitrogen. We're actually able to keep more of these greenhouse gases on site. We're getting more carbon sequestration down into our soils. So we can have a positive impact as far as even global warming. And no matter what your stance is with the climate or the environment, we do know that grazing systems do sequester carbon. They put carbon back into the soil. So depending on how you operate that, your soils and your farm could actually become a carbon sink. And there's a 25% less smaller carbon footprint. And that's the big picture stuff. Like if you're grazing all summer long, you're not having to haul feed back to your animals. And that's taking out the diesel and the wear and tear on your equipment and the fossil fuels that it took to harvest that and bring them to there. What you've actually done is you've just switched the way you've operated or harvested. So instead of using mechanical equipment to go out there and harvest, we're using fences and timing to put animals where they need to be on grass, so that way they can harvest and take that off. And when you look at that economically, like we talked before, that's money in the pocket. Because the biggest cost that most beef operations incur, most dairy operations incur, and what you probably will incur if you start penciling out is mechanical harvested forages, specifically winter feed. So every day you're on pasture means money in your pocket. And if you take nothing else from this, remember that. Every day on pasture equals profitability. And the other thing that I'd like to stress, and then we'll get to that a little bit later, but if you understand the way grass grows, and Gene had one slide in there, please leave residual. Like that's the biggest mistake that I see beginning grazers mess up on. That grass, that buffer, leaving that leaf blade there where it can grow in that exponential growth, in the exponential part of the growth curve, you will get more dry matter per acre by managing that. Don't think about harvesting this like you would for hay. Okay, so because I work for the NRCS, and we're not technically interested in grazing, but we are interested in helping people improve soil and water quality, we are offering funding to assist in setting up grazing systems. Now, we're much broader than that. We work with wetlands, we do manure pits, we grassed waterways, conservation buffer strips, we do tree plantings, silvopasture. I mean, it's pretty broad, and it's a pretty fun job to do. You get to get on a lot of operations, you get to see a lot of different things, and we get to talk to people about that and work with operations, and hopefully have people see that. And the one thing that I tell everybody, the best thing that I can offer them is just the contacts I've made over the last 20 years. If I don't know the answer, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what it is or make something up. We just get in the vehicle and we drive out to somebody that's doing that, and then you can see it. But bringing that back to NRCS and the process, if you want to apply for NRCS cost share money, and that's what we're talking about, there's the opportunity to come in and have cost share, which is a percentage of your project paid for. You would need to start the process by going to your local NRCS field office, and every office has every county in Wisconsin has a local office. Now, that might not necessarily be in your county, but there's a office that represents your county. You need to go in there and fill out an application, and just do that right away. Don't think of the application as a contract. If you're just thinking about grazing, go in there and fill out the application. We work on timelines and rankings, and the sooner you get that in, the better it is. The biggest mistake I see with a lot of people starting out with rotational grazing or coming to us and saying they want to start out with rotational grazing is they made the decision that they want to do it, and they want to do it this summer. Unfortunately, that's not the way our cost share programs work. The best thing to do once you get that thought, is to come to us last year, so that way we can take you through the planning process, we can develop the grazing plan, and we can walk you through the application process. And if your application ranks high enough, then we can offer you cost share. So this is a competitive process. Just because you apply doesn't mean that you're going to get cost share. Now, that being said, grazing is a very competitive practice. And when I say practice, what I'm getting at is, you know, we would call installing a fence, that would be a practice. Installing pipeline, that would be a practice. In implementing prescribed grazing, which is what we're talking about, would be a practice. So the really cool thing about prescribed grazing is, if you do the management, if you work with a technical service provider, a TSP, an extension agent, and you put together a plan that meets our standards, that tells us what your plan is, and we can use that then to help cost share the fencing, the water lines, the lanes, and other systems to help you actually have a successful grazing plan. But you absolutely need that plan prior to a contract. So there is a process here. And so that's why I said the first thing to do, get into an office, get signed up, so that way we can walk you through this. And the other thing too is just have a good conversation with the DC or the SolCon or the technician, whoever you're working with. Just let them know what you want to do. Say, this is what my plan is. I'd like to get this process started, and they'll tell you how to go about that. There's more steps involved in that, but don't be scared of it. You know, nothing's contractual until we sign a contract. This is just getting it started. It's a placeholder to get you into our system. So after you've signed the application, we do have to come out and just determine if it's eligible. Just because you want to graze doesn't mean that we can take government funds and put it at your site. So we need to determine if the site actually does have a resource concern. We are the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and we need to look at things such as soil erosion or water quality. So you might, if you've got the perfect farm and it's all grass, and you've been rotationally grazing for the last 20 years, EQIP isn't the program for you. This is not the path I would tell you to take. Then you go into CSP, and that's a different conversation. Since we're talking about beginning grazers, typically there's a cropland situation that you're going to be bringing into pasture, or there's existing pasture that's overgrazed. And we need to document that. And we need to show that by applying these different fencing, water lines, lanes, managed grazing plan, that there's going to be an improvement on that site. So that way we can justify the spending of federal dollars. So at that point, we would hook you up with someone like Gene or a different TSP, or somebody who is capable of writing a plan to our standards, and that plan will be developed and then brought back to our NRCS office. And then it goes through a ranking process. And finally, if you rank high enough, we're awarded a contract. Like I said, this is a competitive process. And to make this kind of to really paint the picture of what this is, if you've got an interest in putting a buffer along a creek, that's really great, and no one's going to say that that wouldn't be something to do, and there would be no one in our agency that wouldn't support that. But if your neighbor down the road, and I'm going to be extreme here, has a manure pit running directly into that pit and it's overflowing every single year, killing the fish, we need to rank those based off of priority. So just because you have a good practice doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get funded. Now, that being said, you should also have that application resubmitted again and rerun that, because the next time you might rank high enough, and then we can offer you cost share and we can move forward with what your plan is. So common EQIP practices for rotational grazing that we work with to get people started into prescribed grazing. First of all, we need a plan. We need to know what you're going to be doing. We need to make sure that the animals out there match the acres that we're talking about, and that gets back to that 3.5%. So we have animals and we can calculate out what they eat, but grass doesn't grow evenly across the course of the season. And I'm a big component of being conservative, planning for the summer slump. So that way you're still grazing when July and August hits, because as I said before, if you're feeding stored feed to your animals, that's extremely expensive, like 3, 4, depending on what kind of feed you have, 5 times more expensive. So if you plan for the low part of the summer, the lowest producing part of the summer, you can graze the entire length of the grazing season. But then if you set your system up, you could harvest on both ends of that season or that system on your pastures and put that up for winter feed. So it's not like you've lost, but it does allow for plan to be developed that's going to keep you on grass all summer long. And if you work with a good planner, it's not going to impede your ability to take off a mechanical clipping if you would need it. Pasture seeding. There are a lot of different ways to do this. Everyone has an opinion on it. I stick with pretty simple seedings to get people started into prescribed grazing. And what you really need to determine, the biggest things that I've seen for determining what you want to do is going to be how you want to harvest that feed. So there are a ton of great grasses out there. There are a ton of great legumes out there. If you want an opinion, I can give you one. But I think the biggest consideration that I see most people not thinking about is, am I going to put it up as baleage? Am I going to try to put it up as dry hay? If you've got a stand that's 50% red clover and your goal is to put it up for dry hay, well, you may be just really screwed up and you're going to be wrapping everything or putting it up in the silo. So those are conversations that you need to consider from the get-go. And that's not to say that one is wrong and one is right, but that could be an issue depending on the equipment that you have. So this comes back to that prescribed grazing plan, working with someone who understands what we're looking for, and ultimately helping you get set up so that way you've got a profitable system. Fence. Gene talked about the different types of fence. We offer cost sharing on fence. We go board, woven, wood, interior. Our cost share scenarios aren't as broad as that, but we can really cover a lot of different aspects or different styles of fence. So, you know, it's really a matter of you working with us, and if it meets our standards, we'll work with you on that. Now, if you have beef cows and you decide that you wanted to put in a board fence, we couldn't necessarily pay for a board fence around your entire operation because you wanted to. We can pay for what we determined to be the minimum style of fence that we could offer. So maybe a 3-strand high tensile fence. And I think that's about $1.70 a linear foot or something like that for our cost share rates. So you could take that money, then you could always upgrade to a board fence if you wanted that. So those are things to consider. We'll never tell you you can't do more, but we have to be aware of how we spend those funds so that way we can distribute them as well as possible. Now, that is something else I should also mention. This is cost share. This is not a grant. So the idea is to cost share part of the project. And for people who have filed a Schedule F greater than 10 years, we basically over a 3-state area try to develop a bell curve based off of different bids that we receive back. So we collect a bunch of estimates. We figure out what the average 3-strand high tensile fence costs in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and we'll divide those. We'll throw those all into a pool and divide them up, and that's where we get our number from. Now, we do the same thing for woven wire fence and single strand fence, but it's designed off of the bell curve. So some people come out and we pay them more than what their fence would cost because they can get it at a really good rate. They're right next to the contractor. Just different scenarios. Other people are maybe at the 40 or 50%. Unfortunately, we have no control over how that money is distributed every year. But what we can do is we can come back and relook at those rates and we can update them the following year. This year is looking to be tough because of the cost of materials. Anybody who has a contract with us this year should absolutely be concerned about those bids and compare them back to any contract we have because of the price of fencing and posts. They've gone up exponentially. This is the temporary fence. I know we're talking about sheep, but we use this polywire for sheep, beef, everything above. They make multi-strands for sheep operations and goat operations, or you could also use the electronet. Realistically, as far as I'm concerned, whatever you're happy with, we're happy with. The only thing that you have to think about when it comes to NRCS, we will offer you the cost share for the fencing, the water lines, the lanes. But what we need to have out of that is that management plan. We need to see residual. We need to see 5-6 inches of grass left over. We need to see that those animals are being rotated so they're not continuously grazing. So that way we don't cause resource concerns by putting those animals out there. And when I say resource concerns, it could be soil erosion. It could be overgrazing. It could be water quality concerns because you left them 10 days down by the creek because it was hot and you took a stream bank and now it's a mud bank. So one thing here that I like about this picture, you look at the left side of the picture and you look at the right side of the picture, and you know, a lot of people think, man, I could really go in there and I could take more forage off of there. But if you really start looking at the numbers and leaf blades and understanding how grass grows, you know, I would be more inclined to say, yeah, you can maybe take a little more off, but maybe just move them and let that come back faster, because that grass is going to bounce back, because you've got leaf blade there for photosynthesis. You've got roots there that can go down in the soil and grab moisture. You've got that soil armoring, or the grass armoring the soil and protecting evapotranspiration or evaporation from happening, because it's covering the soil and keeping that cooler. So there's a lot going on there that's very different than mechanically harvesting it. And that's a big challenge for new people, but you have to recognize that, because that is money in your pocket once you start to understand how grass grows. Summer water systems, like Gene said, we like to design these. We can go into more of this, and I don't want to take too long. I'm already past. So we designed these, we engineered them to make sure that we can pump water uphill, downhill, and get water to places that we've planned for. So that's something that we work with you on. We have engineers. I've designed hundreds of these systems, and they work fantastic. They are probably the biggest part of a system that there will be failure with. So if you're putting these in there, they're not something that you put in 20 years, it's not going to be a problem. You get leaks, you get frozen pipes, it breaks. It's just part of it. It's not really a big deal, but you have to understand that. Portable tanks, winter watering systems, buried pipeline. The most buried pipeline I think I've ever buried is over 10,000 feet out to 3 different tanks. So we'll trench it out there a long ways to get it away from a wetland or from critical areas, and putting them in spots where you could outwinter or make that work really well for you. Now, I say that because that's the biggest one I've ever done. But in general, you know, you really got to work with those small topographical type of contours that you can put on your farm. Take advantage of the micro topography that you've got. You don't want to put one of these in a low spot. It's always muddy in April. If you've got a spot on your field that's 3 foot higher than this low spot over here, put it on the high spot. Set it in an area that you can rotate around, bale graze or outwinter, feed out on pasture, so that way you're not having to haul that manure back out. Trails and walkways, access roads. We usually use these for dairies. I really would strongly recommend for sheep and beef operations that this is really a last resort. They're super expensive, and when you look at the economics of them, they're not awesome. We do offer cost sharing for them, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but it really should be a last resort. Questions? I jumped pretty fast through that. I should have maybe condense that a little bit. I see we're past 8:30, but if you do have any questions, I'll stick around, and I know that there are some more questions for Gene.
Oh, no, that's fine, Adam. We actually we go till 9 o'clock, so you're just fine. There are some active.
I thought it was 8:30. I apologize.
No, that's fine. We have some active things going on in the chat. Gene's taking care of those, but we have some questions on planting and what kind of equipment do we use to plant, and how do we use the drill. So I don't know if you want a quick look at the chat, or if you want me to read those questions for you. Or Heather,
whatever, if you can read them, and I'll bring up the chat.
Yeah, so Adam, I've actually
as far as
I unmuted myself, and I just thought I would kind of give you just the basics. So we actually have applied and been accepted into the Pollinators Fund. And so we have our prescribed seeding mix, our custom mix. We've purchased our seed, and now we're ready to seed our very first, we're calling them our meadows. It is a very diverse mix. So hearing you say start simple was a little bit like, oh, it did take me back a little. It has 8 different species in it. And we're really wondering what's the best way to seed it. Should we use the Brilliant seeder? Should we be using a no-till drill? How do you calibrate it when you're putting in these multi-species mixes?
So what's out there right now? Is it a bare crop field, or is it existing grass that's been sprayed, or is it a living cover that you're trying to plant into?
Okay, this is my dad. He's going to answer that.
Okay, 35 acres of it was corn ground last year, so we did till it to get rid of some of the trash. And then we've got 8 acres that we're gonna take the hay off. It's old alfalfa, and then we're gonna no-till into it after we take the first cutting off. Well, with the 8 different seeds, now we've been trying to find people to give us a way to seed it. Do we use the oats box, or do we use where you put the alfalfa in order to get it to come through? We're gonna put 18
What type of,
18 pounds per acre is what we're calling for.
and what type of species are we looking at?
We have about 34% meadow fescue. We have 16% how do you say it? Fesculoleum.
Fesculoleum.
We have 16% orchard grass, about 12% ryegrass, the perennial ryegrass, less than 3% alfalfa, about 5.5 red clover. We've got white ladino clover in there at 11%, and then just under 3% of bird's foot trefoil.
And it's all blended together.
Okay.
Oh, already.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would use the Brilliant. I mean, if you've got bare soil, I'd use the Brilliant, and if it's mixed already, that's not a bad thing. What you can do is just go around, and after you've made some passes, you might just want to stir that seed box just so that way the little ones don't make it to the bottom and the light ones to the top. If you've got an agitator in the box, that would be ideal. A lot of them don't, so you might just have to take the time to do that. As far as drilling that into the established alfalfa, that's actually perfect. You know, I'm never scared to drill into established alfalfa. There's a lot of bare soil there, so you can get some good soil to seed contact. I'm always more concerned when people say they want to no-till into something like a smooth brome or a bluegrass. That's a very difficult thing to do. I have seen it done successfully, but I would say more likely than not, that would be a failure. Gene?
So you're saying use the Great Plains drill for the established alfalfa?
Yeah. The big thing is with grass seeds is you don't want to be too deep, and you do want to have a closing wheel. Where we're at up in Outagamie County, we have clay soils, and if you don't have a good press wheel behind you, what happens as soon as it dries up, that opens right up. And if you don't have that plant started, it'll dry right out, and you'll get a lot of seedling mortality.
Okay, and then the
So
other question,
depending on your soils, you got to be careful with that. But Great Plains is good. We use that all the time up here. It's more about depth than anything.
now when you seed a mix like this, do you in a Great Plains drill, do you use the oats box or do you use the seed? I talked to one of the guys that works up in Minnesota, and he said they tried putting it in the seed box and they could not get it to go through a mix like you've done. So what they did, they ended up putting it in where the oats goes out.
I'd probably put it in the oats, and I'd make sure that it's calibrated right. And if it's coming out way too fast, something you could consider, depending on how your drill is set up, is we've run cracked corn with it. So that way that slows it down. You can just run that in there, run a few bags through there, and then calibrate your seed rate again. And what that does is it slows the seed down. It keeps the smaller ones suspended, and that can work really well. In general, though, with these no-till drills, it hasn't been a big issue. We've been putting it in there, stirring it if you don't have an agitator, and planting it.
We've got
Sorry.
Yeah, we've got quite a few other questions we'd like to get to, and at some point I'd like to have dinner. So one I see here from let me go back up. I think it was Leila. Layla was asking about red clover and reproductive problems because of phytoestrogens, but at the same time they're good for controlling parasites. What's the highest percent of clover we'd recommend in a paddock? All legumes actually produce some sort of phytoestrogens. So that as phytoestrogen is a broad class of chemicals. Some can have a positive effect, some can have a negative effect, some have a neutral effect. We are not aware of any negative effects of phytoestrogens from red clover. The only clover that we're aware of is called subterranean clover, but it'll temporarily introduce infertility. It doesn't grow in Wisconsin. It's up in the Pacific Northwest where they've got a much more milder climate. The parasite portion of that is bird's foot trefoil does contain condensed tannins. Bird's foot trefoil is another legume that can reduce, not eliminate, but reduce some of the parasite issues on pasture. What was the third part here? What's the highest percent clover you recommend in a paddock? I sleep really well at night if I've got 50% clover or 60% clover. I'm not too worried about bloat. If I'm below 30% clover in a pasture, I'm thinking about frost seeding or no-tilling into that. We want a pretty strong clover component because it adds quality in the summer when the grasses are getting lignified because it likes that hot weather. It improves the digestibility because it's high in protein. It's productive in summer when our grasses are slowing down because it's got a deep taproot, and it captures nitrogen and gives us some free fertilizer for our grasses. So, in my opinion, clovers are an essential part of a good pasture sward. And we're not seeing any evidence after 30 years of clover, and we've grazed like 90% clover without issue with breeding or lambing or anything from the previous year. So hopefully that answers that question. Carolyn, do we got more questions in the chat box?
Am I muted? Sorry. We just have a question about spreading compost on our pastures and what is the best time of year to do that.
Gene, you want to take that one? There's some, because I've seen research that shows different things with that. So,
compost, and I'm going to describe compost as something that we have actively turned. It's got a carbon nitrogen ratio between 20 and 30 to 1. So it's got some brown material along with the green material, which would be the manure, and it's broken down. We've applied it in the spring, we've applied it in the summer or the fall. The advantage I like about compost, even though it adds to the workload, is that it kills weed seeds if it's properly heated. It kills any pathogens if it's properly heated. The volume gets reduced, so we have less to haul, and the nutrients get concentrated. The other advantage is that when you spread compost on a pasture, we don't see refusal from livestock. Sheep don't want to graze around sheep poop. Cows don't want to graze around cow poop. Now, sheep will graze around cow poop, cows will graze around sheep poop, but when we compost it, it doesn't smell like poop anymore. And that compost application, we can see evidence of that for about 3 years down the road. So if it fits your system, that's fine. That's great. I think it's a good thing to use rather than spreading, plain manure. If we're going to use manure, we might want to think about that on hay ground or crop ground or somewhere else.
I would also like to add with compost that Gene is absolutely right. You need to have broken down compost. If you have a pile of compost and it was wood chips, say, and you can still see the wood in there, and you spread that onto your field, the C to N ratio is going to be all off, and that wood, as it's decomposing, is going to sap your field from nitrogen. So really make sure when you're putting that on there that it is well decomposed compost, and you shouldn't run into any of those issues. So you're having trouble talking tonight.
Right.
So.
Let's see. I see now we've got 8 new messages. We're falling behind here, Adam.
There's a discussion on dung beetles in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I see Sherry's hand. I was going to say
yes.
Sherry needs to answer that one. She's done a lot of research. Sherry is about 6 or 7 miles away from me. Has done a lot of work on that. It's a really fascinating topic. And if you get a chance, watch the video that she posted the link for. We did a program on that this, I think it was at December or so. We did the dung beetle one. There was a question here about Sericea lespedeza. It is a condensed tannin forage. And this is not getting out of my area because there's different varieties of lespedeza. One is a forage type and one's an invasive species. One of the folks I know says it does grow in Wisconsin. I have not seen much of this Sericea lespedeza growing here yet. If it's an invasive species, we probably would want to, well, Adam wouldn't want us to use it at all if it's listed as an invasive species, but I would be very cautious about doing that. And clarify, again, we'd have to kind of get a little bit more information about which one is the invasive one. There's a Korean lespedeza, the Sericea lespedeza. and it might also depend where you are in the state. The population I'm aware of is just west of us towards the Mississippi River in the Grant and Crawford County area. If you're far north, I'm guessing you're probably not going to have that persist. For condensed tan and forage, really our only option that I'm aware of that works very well is bird foot trefoil.
I see something on the jumping worms. I don't think compost would have any impact on those. Unfortunately, they're here to stay and I see them spreading.
And Jean, there's a question for you about stockpiling, grazing stockpiled forages in the winter.
You know, if our goal is profit and feeding less hay, learning to stockpile is a critical skill, because it's a cheap way to feed. We can grow some incredibly high quality grass in the fall time of the year because of those cool nights and warm days that we have in September and early October. The digestibility on this stuff it's not quite like feeding corn, but we're getting pretty darn close. And you know, once we get into a freeze and that those plants go dormant, it dehydrates, but we don't lose the sugars, we lose the water. So we've got all the energy, we've got all the protein, and some species do stockpile a little bit better than others. Our best year we've ever done, we've grazed stockpiled tall fescue to the end of January. And you know, there's got to be reasonable if we get snow, there's got to be a reasonable amount of forage underneath the snow for it to be worthwhile for that sheep or that goat to paw through it and get it out. So if we've only got 3 inches of residual, that's not a stockpile. That's next year's growth. That's not something we're going to be grazing. But if we've got 6, 8 inches, 10 inches of grass out there, whether it's snow covered or not, sheep will graze right through that snow and dig through that snow for a while. Now it's Wisconsin, right? What do we get snow, it warms up, gets to 40 degrees, that snow gets really soft and wet, then the next day it's 20 below, right? We get a really hard frozen crust on that might be harder for those sheep to bust through. You know, growing a stockpile starts in August. For at least the southern part of the state, maybe early August if you're in further northern Wisconsin, and can get us through quite deep into the winter. At some point in Wisconsin is going to snow when we can no longer get more energy out of the forage than what the sheep is expending. Then we need to think about feeding hay. I see we've got at least one person on, it looks like, from Missouri. Missouri should be grazing year round. One of my beef guys sends his cows to Missouri in the winter so he can take a winter vacation, and they graze all winter on stockpiled tall fescue in Missouri.
So I see we've got a question on fence. For NRCS, yes, we do cost share on perimeter fence as long as it's converting crop ground to prescribed grazing, and there is a management plan on that. Just because, well, we have to proceed with caution because we won't cost share on all perimeter fence. It has to be around an existing crop field that's converted to prescribed grazing, and it does need to meet state statute.
So there's a question here on the end here from Karen on the assessment of the effectiveness of bioworma. I have no direct experience with the effectiveness of bioworma other than what I've read for the research reports. I was planning to put together a small mini grant to kind of assess this. For everyone else, bioworma is a natural soil fungus called Dudentonia flagrans. It's a parasitic fungus that attacks nematodes in the soil, or the parasitic nematodes in the soil that you feed to sheep, and it comes out in the poop, and then it's kind of a cool thing. What scared the bejesus out of me, Karen, was the cost. It's a really expensive way to get parasites, but again, we're using biology to fight biology. I certainly like that strategy, something that's maybe becomes part of our soil ecosystem and works 24/7. Maybe next year or this year, we'll try and do a small trial and see, at least to get the information on how it would apply here for Wisconsin. But it's very intriguing. They've studied this for quite a few years, and now the bioworm is the commercial product.
I see you have a question here as well, as far as NRCS help people make suggestions on a good forage plan and adding fencing, water lines, and to get some forage suggestions. Yes, we absolutely help with that. So do TSPs, so do extension agents. It all comes back to having a good conversation up front and developing that grazing plan. And you don't have to do it all in 1 year. You can have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which can all be part of one contract. It doesn't have to be part of any contract, or we can do that as multiple contracts. It really depends on what's going to fit your situation best. Ultimately, as NRCS, we don't really care what your system winds up like, as long as it can meet our standards and you're comfortable with it and you're happy with it when we're done. Now, that being said, Gene and other TSPs, myself, I'm a strong believer in copying success. So if you know what you want to do, you need to get into a vehicle and get onto a farm that's successfully implementing what you want to do.
Very good. I think we're oh, maybe there was one. We'll take maybe one last question if we have one. Maybe it's just a discussion about grazing through snow. So very good. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for Gene and Adam for sharing your passion and your expertise in grazing. And I think anybody can contact you at a later date if more questions come up. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and hope to hear from you later. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Gene. Always